Hello, everyone. My name is Jon Radwan, and I direct the Institute for Communication and Religion in Seton Hall University's College of Human Development, Culture, and Media. I'm joined today by two wonderful colleagues. Eric Johnston teaches in the School of Theology, and Nancy Enright is our core director and a professor of English. We're here today to talk about Pope Francis's letter on the role of literature in formation. This letter came out in July, and if anybody would like to read it, you can access it at vatican.va. If you've never been there before, it's a little overwhelming. There's a lot of papal discourse. I recommend using the search field and just searching for July 17th, 2024. That's when he released this letter on the role of literature in formation. So I have a series of questions here, and I'll pitch them to each of our guests as we move through and help us explore this letter from Pope Francis that we all feel is brilliant. Our first question is just general. Dr. Enright, can I ask you to please start? Tell us a little bit about the letter and why you think he wrote it and why you think he wrote it now.
Okay, thank you, John, so much for inviting us to be here. This letter is a very important document, and I think the timing is great because we're living in an age where reading is becoming less and less valued. Everybody's used to the short bites and this, you look something up and you read the AI version of it, or you read the synopsis. But reading is really, a precious thing. And, I've literally devoted my whole academic life to reading, and talking about reading and writing and so forth. And I'll never forget, if I can just tell a brief story that sort of connects with this. I had a student one time, I loaned him a literal book, and he said, "I just want to thank you for rekindling my love for reading." Because he said, since I've been in college, I've been using so much online material, I've sort of lost touch with that, which is really kind of sad. And I think the Pope is trying to get us back into that love for the book.
Okay, wonderful. Love for the book. Dr. Johnston, do you have anything to add on why Pope Francis wrote this letter now?
Yeah, well, I think that Francis is concerned about love for other people, actually, even more. I connected this letter in October. He wrote a bigger letter. So this is sort of a minor papal document, but he wrote the biggest kind of papal document on the heart of Jesus, and he said in that he has this long reflection on what is meant by the heart, and he said the heart isn't one part of the person or another part of the person. He said it's like all the blood vessels come together and connect in the heart, and the heart. He said he likes to think of the heart as the whole person, as everything coming together. And so the heart isn't just our perception or just our feelings or just our decisions or just our thinking. It's everything coming together. And I felt like this letter was a way of putting that into practice, of seeing like one way of nurturing the heart of rather than having sort of a purely intellectual discourse, trying to put ideas together with perception and experience and feeling and a more holistic idea of what it means to be human and what it means to relate to other people. I think it fits into his talk. A big word with Francis has been synodality, which means walking with other people and listening. And I think that he was trying to say, here's a little practice in listening, in learning how to perceive what other people are concerned about and enter into other people's experience through books.
Thank you for bringing up two of Francis's main themes, the heart and synodality. The letter tells us that he's concerned that there's not enough reading in education, and especially in priestly education. And so he considers the message, he says it's radical that he would like people to officially take time out to read and discuss in tranquility. And so that starts to lead to the key term, or one of the key terms in the title of the letter. It's on the role of literature in formation. And so, Dr. Johnston, I think you're an expert on formation. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just was texting with a former student of mine who's now a priest. So I teach men, we say, in formation for the priesthood. And there are many facets of formation. And my friend, my former student, was saying, he was joking about all these things that he learned in class, but he said, now I'm actually in the parish and I'm working with people. And he said an awful lot of my time is communicating, is talking and listening and being in conversation. And he said, and running a parish. And I think formation is a word in seminaries and in the Catholic world to say it, to get at the idea that education is bigger than just learning particular ideas, and it's shaping the whole person, to be able to engage in the kind of work that you're called to. And yeah, I don't think we've said, he says at the very beginning, initially I planned this to be a letter just to priests and to seminaries, to say seminarians in their formation for the priesthood need to read novels. And then he said, I realized this is important for everybody's formation. So the letter is kind of halfway between. He's like, this is kind of for priests and kind of for everybody. But I was really struck. My student said, I said, what do you feel like you should have learned in seminary? And he said a lot of things that I would have been really annoyed if we'd done this. When I was a seminarian, I would have said, oh, this is so dumb. Who cares about all this mushy people stuff? And he says, and now I realize, like, that's what I do all day as a priest, is work with people and try to listen to their experience, try to enter into their experience, try to communicate with them and talk to them. And I haven't yet responded, but I realized after we were talking, like, I need to recommend this letter. And the point of this, like, what should you be doing? You should probably be reading more books, Father.
That's a wonderful description. The theme at the opening is expansive. His original plan was to help priests and help seminaries develop their educational plan. And he very quickly realized that reading is for everyone. Dr. Johnston just made references to requiring students to do things that they might not realize are important as they're doing them, and might hopefully later appreciate them. Dr. Enright, you teach or you direct our core. Do you have any thoughts on requiring people to have experiences that might be formative?
Yes, and I really believe in that. But before I get into that, I just want to affirm what Dr. Johnston said about love. I think that's really at the heart of this, because what Pope Francis is saying, and I think in sections 9 and 10 maybe, is where he talks about how reading gets us past some of our insularity and our, like, sort of narrowness, and that can help in the things that your student was talking about. But just about requiring students to read things, sometimes it takes years, maybe even decades, for a text to really mean something to a student. And just to give an example of that, I just did a book with a former student on Perpetua, and, like, he translated the text. He's now teaching in the core, Frank Hunter. And that was a beautiful experience for me. But Frank told me that when he first read that text, he had Father Larissy, he was a sophomore, he read that. And he said he didn't really get it. He didn't really, relate to it that much. Over the years, after he took the class, he went on and got his master's in English. That's when that text really, he started to translate it as a devotional, and it really came to mean something to him. And I've heard of other, there's many cases like that, where the person's 35 years old and they're going through a crisis, and then they think of Augustine's Confessions, or, that kind of thing. So I think sometimes, we require students to read things that they may not get right away, but they'll get it later.
That's part of my faith in teaching, is the moment is not always what I might dream it might be, but I can dream freely about the future. And one metaphor that I've been taught about teaching is throwing pennies. And so throwing pennies into a deep well of student potential knowledge, and sometimes the pennies land and it's a wonderful thing, and if they don't, that's okay too. It's not a reason not to throw the pennies. And since we came to the theme of requirements, I do want to jump down a little bit on our list of questions. I hope I don't throw my guests off. But one of Pope Francis's themes here is that people should be open to advice about what to read, but ultimately they should make their own decisions about what to read. He describes his teaching experience in the 1960s, where he had a job, so he had to have his students read a particular text, but he also encouraged them to read on their own outside, and made both texts come together, the required and the chosen. Could you talk a little bit about choices in reading, and then maybe some of your own reading choices and what might have influenced you? And I think it's your turn, Dr. Johnston. So again, sorry to jump down, but
choices in reading. I mean, I do think a lot about like we teach in the core the allegory of the cave, and I think one of the things that's important in Plato's allegory of the cave is that you don't know what you're missing when you're stuck in the world of illusion and darkness, and then somebody tells you that there's a bigger world. You say, no, there isn't, and that sounds too difficult, and I don't want to go there. And I think I do think that one of the tasks of education is to push them to go there, because in some senses we're not going to go somewhere that we haven't heard of, and we need somebody to lead us. I think that's part of what pedagogy means. But I think also that there's a stepwise movement that's in the cave too, that you sort of have to see things one step at a time. And he talks about how once you read anything that you can get your fingers on, that you can start to appreciate, like reading is meaningful, then you kind of catch the bug, and maybe as you discover, and so maybe you start with something that isn't very profound, but starts to move you deeper. I guess for examples, I mean, there's a lot we could talk about. But one thing that I would say is, many years ago, my wife and I decided that for Black History Month every year, we try to read one piece of like Black fiction, or literature or history, and we would read. So I don't know, like I didn't really get it. I didn't really know what I was going for at that point. But as I read, and each year I read, like I saw more and more what it was I was looking for. And I think that's very funny, where you don't know what you don't know until you sort of edge your way in.
All right, that's wonderful. So the theme of edging your way out of the darkness of the cave into the light from a book, it matches our lighting in this room.
Yeah.
Dr. Enright, do you have any thoughts maybe about a book that helped you come to the light, an example?
Well, I think for me, the one that would come to mind is Dante's Divine Comedy. I read that in graduate school. I had somehow gotten all through high school and college without reading it, and I just found it transformative, I guess you could say, in the sense that it just got me thinking in a new way. And we teach that in the core, we teach it in excerpts, and I'm teaching it right now actually in my journey class. And we have Dante going through hell and purgatory. And what he's really, the way I understand the text, is that he's rejecting these sins in himself. It's his own journey. And I think the thing that really is striking is that Virgil, who is this embodiment of like poetry and reason, he can lead him a long way. But when it actually comes to paradise, it's Beatrice who was, the woman he loved, and who sort of symbolizes for him charity and God's love and God's wisdom. She has to take him into heaven. And I think that's the sort of a nice juxtaposition of how literature and other others of the arts can lead us a long way. And at some point, grace has to take over, and they work together. And I think Francis is sort of talking about that, and Dante to me epitomizes that.
That's a wonderful love theme, right? That you can't do it alone. That we need grace. That we need one another to grow, to come to the light.
Yeah, I love Dante too. And I like to imagine like what is he actually describing happening? And he starts by saying, halfway through my life I was lost, and I was with my students start off like, what does this sound like? And I'm like, that sounds like a midlife crisis. He's 40 and he's like, what am I doing with my life? And then Virgil appears to him, and I always kind of imagine that maybe what that means is he's sitting in his room and he looks over and he sees his favorite book, and he picks up and starts to read. But yeah, one of the questions I know that you want to get to, John, is about things beyond reading, and yeah, he gets to Beatrice. Beatrice is a metaphor for grace, but she's also like a real person.
Yeah.
He knows, and it's interesting how literature can get him really far, and at some point it needs to be the love of like a real person, and somehow there's a connection between that too. Like it's not a disjunct of like, oh, books are here and real people are here, but the books lead him to find what it is he appreciates about the other person, and to be drawn more into the other person. And I like the continuity of that. Again, like my priest, my priest friend that I was talking about, like maybe the more you read, the more you can look up from your reading and see real people in front of you.
Yeah, that's a wonderful description. That as we read, we encounter characters. Those characters are people with strengths and flaws, and they face situations. And surprise, so are we, and so are our neighbors. So as we read, it's an exercise in deep listening. One of Francis's themes is that books take longer to digest than other arts. And so I think that leads us toward the pair of questions you were just referencing. What can literature do that nothing else can? And then the parallel or corollary question is, what can't literature do? Dr. Enright, would you like to take the first one?
Sure. I think the key thing is like that it can enlarge our minds and our hearts, and that's getting back to love, because if it's just like reading books and it never impacts your life in any way, then it's really not that significant. But if it can make you a more compassionate, a more understanding, even a wiser person in your interactions with actual people in life, that's, I think, the whole thrust of at least part of what he's saying here. Because when he talks about formation, I mean, that's got to be part of formation for everybody, not even just priests. And also he talks about in one point about how we can experience things in literature in a way that it would take years to experience in life. So like literature can do something that, like, you could read a Tolstoy story and see like a whole person's like a life and unfold and learn from that life that it would take maybe decades to do in real life. So that's something literature can do.
You could go around the world in 80 days.
Yeah, that's right.
Without leaving your couch. In maybe 5 hours, you could read that book. Dr. Johnston, did you have something on this theme?
Yeah, I mean, I like, on the one hand, yeah, there's an immersion, and you can see, most books are, or a lot of books are, more than 5 hours. It's like a really long, so if you compare it to a movie or something, like your attention span lags in a movie, and a book, I think, maybe some people's attention span lags with a book, but a book calls you to keep at it, and to keep at it often over many days or weeks, but also over many hours of reading, and to enter deeply into an experience, to hear. I think a book can speak to you about the interior of characters. It can speak to you about length, and so you can follow somebody through a long experience. That I mean, I was talking to my students about this in core the other day. I don't know that in real life you can get like this much experience. Like, have I heard as many stories from my mother as I've heard in some of these serious books or longer books that I've read. You really could go deep in. On the other hand, I really like something I hadn't thought about that Francis talks about, is how much the book demands of you to construct. Like there's something very passive in watching a movie where it's like, this is what it looks like. You don't use your imagination. We'll do all that for you. In a book, you have to fill in a lot of the gaps, and you have to enter in, and on the imaginative or experiential level, but also on the intellectual level. It leaves you. He says it leaves you a lot of time for sort of a dialogue, for a criticism. I think there's time as you read to say. My wife really likes to talk about the importance of unlikable characters. Like sometimes people say, well, I didn't like that book, I didn't like the main character, and she says, you're not supposed to like the main character. Like, that's the point, is you're reading through this and you're like, ugh, like, what is the matter with you? But then as you criticize the character, you have time to think about yourself and to say, how much is that me? And there's time to engage in a dialogue with the author to say, well, no, I think you're being kind of unfair, or you're being reductive, or, oh, you see things that I don't see, or I see things that you don't see. And there's a dialogue that happens there too, that there's again, what Francis says is there's a lot of room where you have to construct things. You have to do your own work in engaging the book. And I don't know that anything else can do that like a book.
So in media, there are many different modes, and so books are in the language mode. And I liked how you brought out Francis's theme of work, that energy and effort is put into reading, as opposed to perhaps some other media, which is more feeling oriented and can wash over you, and maybe doesn't require, although it is open to, focused attention and labor. Other media forms like music, we can just have on in the background. And similarly with televisions, everywhere in airports and so on, they're there, and you can choose to focus on them and put the work into interpreting what's going on. But in the broader culture, frequently we don't devote the time to interpret our music. We more feel our music. And similarly with many media, we're evolving and changing. So films kind of aren't just 2 hours anymore. You can binge watch an entire season, and people do, and I do. And I don't think I want to say that it's just washing over me as I watch an entire season of some important program. What am I watching?
The Bear?
No.
Oh no.
How about I recently my wife and I, we recently watched the entire Lord of the Rings movies back to back.
There you
Wow.
go.
That's hours.
Good choice. Yeah.
But
That's an immersion, yeah.
and I have read the books, and so I do want to say it's a different experience, but I appreciate the artistry that went into imagining it for me, and I can critique and think about it. So sure, literature does some things that other arts don't do, and it also does the same things that the other arts do. To move us to one of our central questions here, Dr. Johnston, I'm going to start with you again. What does this letter have to do with Christianity more broadly?
Yeah, I think if the gospel is good news, then it has to be good news for real people, and we have to understand what it means to be a real person. I think in seminary formation, which is my work, it's easy to be reductive and to set up a question that we know will be answered in our favor, and you want to make it so that you'll win the argument, but then when you engage real people in all their complexity, that's more demanding, and I think more real. If we believe that God is the creator, then we believe that everything about humanity is real and is part of God's plan, and we have to deal with that, and we have to speak to that complexity and that fullness. If we believe that sin and original sin, the fall, is real, then we have to deal with the fallenness and the brokenness of people, and see that in its reality, in its wholeness. Again, what I said at the beginning about the heart, about seeing the whole thing, and so if we want to preach to and speak to real people, then we have to understand the reality of people. And I think that that's one of the ways that this is really important. One of the ways that Francis talks about the heart of Jesus as the idea that God enters into the whole of human experience, and we can't just write off the parts that are inconvenient to us. I think literature makes us deal with the inconvenient parts.
You reminded me of your difficult characters theme from before, right? Real people have real flaws and strengths, and in real life it might be tempting to avoid those difficult people, and the Christian love theme is about contacting those real people, including the difficult ones, and demonstrating, showing, proving love. Dr. Enright, did you have some thoughts on the question about what this has to do with Christianity?
Well, I think what Eric was saying is that, it helps us to engage with people that we wouldn't perhaps have contact with, but that could relate to actual people we do know. And I just was reading a very brief commentary on Dorothy Day, and we just had her granddaughter here at Seton Hall. And like, Dorothy Day loved literature, and so with all of her work with the poor and social justice, she also was very embedded in getting theology through literature. She actually said that, and meeting people. This author who was writing about Dorothy Day said she would meet characters in literature that would be real people for her. They were almost like friends to her, and she would learn from those friends. And just getting on to, you mentioned The Lord of the Rings. I teach a course on Tolkien and Lewis, faith and fantasy. Like, faith can be embedded in a work almost, like, and then you bring it out, and that's what I love to teach in those classes, and the students really enjoy that, because you see Christ, who is incarnate. He can be incarnate in a work. And Tolkien actually said about The Lord of the Rings, he said this is essentially a Catholic work, because he was a very devout Catholic, and he said unintentionally at first, but intentionally in the revision. So I love that quote, and just seeing those things in literature can really help to, especially for students who are like sort of not particularly churched, if you want to say, that to see some of these things in Tolkien, whom they love, or Lewis, and then say, look, oh, okay, he's looking at this spiritual reality.
The Tolkien quote about writing a Catholic book without intending to write a Catholic book, I think, loops back to our formation theme from the beginning, because Tolkien is formed within the tradition. Mm-hmm. He's primed to be developing themes such as incarnate love, and as he's working his way through the process, he's alert and aware as an author. He's a top-level author, so he gradually comes to realize what he's doing has been kind of within him all along as part of his formation.
Yep.
We're nearing the end of our time. There are other questions. Please forgive us for skipping some of them. I'm going to jump toward the end for a more general question as we head toward our wrap-up. Dr. Johnston, how do you think this letter helps us understand Pope Francis and our times here in the 21st century?
Well, I guess I talked about Pope Francis a little at the beginning with the heart and with the synod and listening. I think Francis is a very keen observer of our times and of the kind of the division in our times, where I think we fail to see one another. Not to be too political, but they said a lot of what has happened with the election. On the one hand, is that there are a lot of people, working people, and who feel like they're not seen and not understood and not appreciated, and there's a lot of discourse about the elites who don't understand people, and that's a complicated conversation. But I do think the way that people don't feel seen or heard is important. I think on the other hand, to be able to enter into the experience of a migrant, of somebody who's fled another country, a hard situation, caring for I wish that we could read a really good novel and that voters had to read a really good novel about what illegal immigrant means, like who those people really are and what their experience is, and we can reduce things to sound bites or to political slogans. Not reduce things, reduce people to slogans, and fail to see people in their reality. And I think Francis, on so many levels, is saying this is a real danger, and there's a real danger. I think Francis believes a danger within the church, that the church can turn into an ideology and turn into sort of abstract ideas, and you just win. I've been in conversations with very good theologians at conferences, and you bring up real situations, and they're like, well, I don't want to think about real people. Like it should all fit into this box. And you say, well, if you can't deal with reality, you're not talking about real Christianity. You're not talking about Christ, who made contact with reality. So I think that Francis sees that abstraction and that ability not to see one another as a real problem of our time.
You said so much that I appreciate and would like to dig deeper into. Francis, in this letter, very clearly says that binary thinking, either or thinking, is not the way to go. And one of his major themes for his papacy is a culture of encounter. And when we encounter one another in real situations, ideally it should be a both and rather than an either or. And so much of our media culture is oriented toward quick judgments, sound bites, somehow giving you enough evidence to make your either or decision. And when something difficult comes up, you don't have to engage it because you already have your either or your or, rather than the difficult work of the both and the and. Dr. Enright, we're coming up on the end of our time. Did you want to say a little bit about how the letter helps us understand Pope Francis in our times?
Well, I think one of the things, as Eric was saying, Pope Francis wants us to think about the other, the marginalized, the people on the periphery, as someone with whom to engage, as real people. And literature can help us do that. And he talks about how even in the early days of the church, there was an engagement with what they would be considered pagan literature. And like you have St. Paul quotes from Greek poets that were not Jews, that were not Christian, quoting from them in the Areopagus, because he's trying to engage with that culture and understand them and speak their language. So we really have to do that on so many levels. And, just the example with the migrants is a really good example. If literature helps us even to understand the situation of another human being, then it's doing a service toward love. And that brings us back, of course, obviously that's what Christianity is. So I think Francis is always saying, think about the other, think about the people that are excluded. Because I think one of the things that is a theme with Francis is not to think of, those outside, those inside, but how do we reach out to those on all different parts of the world and all parts of the perspectives of what people could be thinking about with religion or politics or whatever.
Wonderful. I love closing on this theme of engagement and encounter. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Again, my name is Jon Radwan, and I direct the Institute for Communication and Religion at Seton Hall University. Our guests today have been Dr. Eric Johnston and Dr. Nancy Enright, and we've been discussing Pope Francis's letter on the role of literature and formation. I encourage all of you to read it at vatican.va. And then if you're interested in our content, our web address is shu.edu/communication-religion. Thank you again. Have a beautiful day.